Hi, everyone. I am so excited for you to listen to this interview with Ken Gavin. So, Ken is the guy that you want for a tour of Valley Forge. Not only does he going to get into the interesting details of it, but he thrives on understanding how leadership impacted the decision and how leaders showed up for the moment. And I am so lucky that I got to do this interview with him. Because out of our conversation, you're gonna hear a different story of Valley Forge than I think most of us understood. Most of the people there were immigrants. The number of languages, the number of religions, the diversity. Well, some people would argue it's the moment where America came together is at Valley Forge, that we really kinda united at Valley Forge. And at that point in time, it was the 3rd largest city in America, and George Washington's the mayor. So George Washington's trying to make, and in the coldest and coldest moments, all of these people work together, and the united cause that they have is this idea of what it means to be an American. And that's the conversation that's about to unfold with Ken Gavin. Enjoy. Hi, everyone. I am very excited to talk about George Washington because I think this is a version of the story you've not heard before, unless you have dived into an obnoxious number of books. I've only tapped the surface when we talk about Washington. So, Ken, I know the gravitas you bring to how much you've been committed to not only learn about Washington and the Revolutionary War, but in particular Valley Forge. But why don't I give you a moment to just set the stage? And I'd like you to tell the story not just from your historic experience, but that's only been a part of your story is how you've evolved not only from that, but as in your career, et cetera, because I feel like there's a good intersection of how that's worked. So how do you want to summarize what brings you to this moment?
Well, first of all, thank you, Elaine, for having me. It's really an honor to be here and to be part of the series and to discuss Washington, which can be a little daunting sometimes. But for me, when you look at him as a human being, there are actually a lot of lessons that you can pull out of his life that you might not look at otherwise. We imagine him as the marble man or somebody in a bronze statue or at a painting who was sort of preordained to lead this revolutionary effort from the military perspective. It's hard to figure out who he is beneath all of that, but there are a lot of lessons from his life. There's certainly failures. There are moments when he's disappointed, and they all helped him grow. And I think if we look at him that way, then we can begin to see parallels in our own lives in the growth and our growth over time. What brings me to this moment? Wow, a lot. I started coming to Gettysburg probably when I was 6 or 7.
Okay.
It was my first trip here, and I've been coming back for 40 years at this point in time. And it's a place that's really part of the fabric of my being. There's something new that you learn, something new that you see every time that you come here. Professionally, my life has taken sort of two different paths that sometimes come together. So from the perspective of my full-time day job, I serve as the chief communications officer for the Archdiocese of Philadelphia. We are a major nonprofit in the Philadelphia region. Of course, we are faith-based. We employ over 12,000 people in 5 counties. And we work, of course, in our parishes, but also we offer social services to several 100,000 people in need each year, regardless of their faith background or if they are of no faith background whatsoever. We're there to serve and fill a number of needs for folks who are facing really dire circumstances in many instances. We have an education system as well. We educate tens of thousands of students within the 5 county region each year, and a number of other ministries and outreach initiatives and efforts. So it's a really, really big organization. And as you can imagine, communications needs for an organization of that size are
They're
pretty
very
big.
predictable, aren't they?
Sometimes yes, sometimes no. As with every organization, there are sometimes the need for crisis communications, which we handle, and is a need for a lot of communication work with good events too. I was really fortunate in 2015 to be running communications for the Archdiocese when Pope Francis came to the city of Philadelphia.
Mm.
Uh, from a workflow perspective, one of the most daunting and challenging periods of my life. I think we were working probably 18 to 20 hours a day, 7 days a week, particularly in the final lead up to that visit, final 6 months. But an incredible experience that very few people would ever even get close to at the level that I was able to see that. So really, that was a blessing and an honor in many ways. And the work of communications and what you do over the years, you learn how to effectively work with people who come from different circumstances of life. When you're trying to communicate a message effectively, you have to understand how people receive communication, what is going to register with them, how you have to nuance what you're saying, not to bend the truth in any way, but to present a message in a way that's going to be digestible,
And impactful.
impactful, resonate, right? So you really do learn a lot in the communications world, and specifically the public relations angle of it, about human psychology, about how to understand and work with different groups of people. And you learn a lot about contingency.
Mm.
You learn a lot about planning for the unexpected, because you could be working on a massive project, and at any given moment, there could be something unfortunate as like a building catching fire. And I've dealt with those sorts of things over the years, school fires, and thank God, no children were hurt, but you have a school community now that's without a building. So everything else that you've been working on during the course of the day, you're now shifting focus, shifting gears, and you're now focusing on this need to assist this community. There's always the unknown, and understanding how to account for the potential of the unknown to creep into your workday at any given point in time is a skill that you pick up over the years. And you also understand that having the right team of support around you is incredible because, chief communications officer, it's a title, right? But the chief never does anything by himself in any way, shape, or form. And you have to learn how to build solid teams. When you get to understand an organization, organizational needs, you begin to build a team around you, not of people that you supervise per se, but who work with you and who support the work of the mission of the organization and can help to drive that forward.
If you're doing this intentionally, because every time you're doing something, I'm mapping in my head, I'm going Washington, Washington, Washington. So you're just a teaser, but let's bring that into the story. So that's what you've done professionally, but as much as Gettysburg, as much of your story, Valley Forge is equally as much as your story.
Oh gosh, Valley Forge has been part of my life for a little bit longer than Gettysburg. I grew up 15 minutes away from Valley Forge. Some of my earliest memories are of my parents taking me there on a Sunday and pulling me around the walking paths in this little red radio flyer wagon. And before I could even read, my mother reading the wayside markers to me. And I found this entirely fascinating. I could not tell you why, but for some reason in my little toddler brain, this was so cool and I knew it. And it was something I look forward to every Sunday, doing this. If it was really bad weather and we couldn't go, I was disappointed. When 1984, when the CBS miniseries came out on the life of George Washington, which is excellent, I was 4.5 going on 5.
Yeah.
That
You were glued.
riveting television for me. We recorded it on VHS, and for years, if I needed to find solace or be entertained, I would watch that over and over and over and over and over again. And then there was a moment when I was maybe 8 or 9, and we had gone to Valley Forge in February. They were doing a program celebrating Washington's birth.
Hmm.
And there were Park Service personnel in the huts at the Muhlenberg Brigade, and they were doing a living history program. And there was one man doing a chaplain impression and another man who was portraying a common soldier. This was my first exposure to living history. And I thought, oh, wow. I mean, here is this.
It came to life.
Came to life.
It's what you saw on the TV show in front of you, people in the dress, people talking about it.
Tangible, three-dimensional, interactive. And I was on top of the world. I was probably there for half an hour. God knows what questions I asked, if they were intelligent or not, even for an 8 or 9-year-old. But for that 30-minute period, these two rangers made me the focus of their world because they saw a young person with a real, sincere interest in this topic, and they tried to support that interest. And when we were done, they gave me these two little toy lead soldiers. And so fast forward to many, many, many years later, I had been working at Valley Forge as an official and candidate guide for some time and doing living history programming there for some time. And we were commemorating the March end. So it's December.
Okay.
And it was a bitter night. And there were two Rangers who I'd worked with extensively, and both had recently retired. And we were outside at a briefing meeting, safety meeting for the event. And this one guy who had just retired, Bill Trotman, he looked at me and said, "Oh, why do you do this?" Like, why do you do this? I mean, he's like, why do you volunteer to put yourself through this misery? It's so cold. And I said, Bill, and then I told him the story.
Yes.
And his face just went white. His jaw dropped. And I said, Bill, are you all right? And he said, I am. He said, just hold on a minute. And he calls over another Ranger, George Matlock, who was recent.
And you've known for a while.
Knew
So
for a
it's
while.
right?
Yep.
This is why you've told me a version of the story, so I know what's coming.
Yep. So he calls George over and he said, now tell George what you told me. And I told George the story. And now George is very silent. And I said, what's up with you two? And Bill looked at me and he said, that was us. And I was like, whoa. Like, I said, are you sure? And he said, yeah, I'm sure. He said, look, that was our thing. George and I worked together as a team. And if we found a young person who was really interested, that was our thing. We would give them a little token like that to take away. And I said, well, Bill, they're still on my desk at work all those years later. And I'd worked with these guys for years, had never known we'd had this path crossing earlier in life. And it was an incredibly emotional moment for all three of us.
To watch it.
Yeah. But you full circle, but I walked away with that. And it taught me a lesson, when you do the work of public history, which I've done for well over 20 years now in many capacities, in addition to my full-time job, you have oftentimes a limited interaction with a visitor. Maybe it's 10 minutes, maybe it's 2 hours. You may see that person again somewhere down the line. You may never see them again. But what that moment taught me was no matter the time that you have, you are making an impact. You're making an impact by the work you do with public history. And you may be fortunate enough to be contacted by somebody or run into somebody who will tell you, I appreciate what you did with us, and here's why. And you may not. But I think it does demonstrate that the impact is real, even when we have those minimal interactions, not a lot of time, with people who are there and want to learn more about the past.
Because there's something amazing about roots. I think in my story and growing up, I've always craved more roots because I think there's something about the American experiment where if you really show up to it, you don't know where your roots are because we can't define it like everyone else. Like if you think about it for a second, and so I'm going to take the moment like they credentialized you and said you are now, your enthusiasm for American history, you are part of us, and you're part of this adventure, and obviously the adventure it took. And one of the reasons I'm committed to this conversation that we're having now and I've been having is because I think there's something about showing up as an American to realize it doesn't matter whatever's happened before. If you sign up to the idea as an American, you have roots. Automatically, instantaneously, this is who you are if you sign up to the idea. Because I think all of us as Americans, how do we talk about ourselves? We talk about the roots that take us out of America, right? We talk about our ancestry, and that is interesting. And I think it gives us a perspective. But let's just talk about who we are as Americans. And I'm going to segue a little bit, but I think that's one of the reasons hearing you talk about George Washington and Valley Forge that helped me continue to redefine that to sign up as American, you sign up to the idea, not the check marks or the characteristics that we all think, because the rest of the world does that definition, but it's not what it defines us. So I've given that teaser of a topic. So I'm going to thank you for the side eye. Let's talk about George Washington's growth,
Sure.
right? It's a little mixed, but for the most part, he grows up privileged and he gets good mentorship. And he's trying to navigate how to be one of the people who can take advantage of that privilege and be a leader in that privileged space.
I mean, let's start young and let's talk a little bit about the world in which he develops. For me, and I'm glad you talked about roots, because for me, when I look at things as a public historian, yeah, the concept and idea of culture is extremely important. Because Marshall Salins tells us this in his great work, Islands of History, from the mid-1980s, is that history is culturally ordered. And what he means by that is those who participate in events that we now say are historic are a product of the culture in which they grow up. They're a product of that society.
It's a story that we tell to keep whatever civilization we want alive.
And it impacts the decisions they make while they're processing and working through an historic event, just as the culture in which we live oftentimes impacts how we remember or reflect upon an event. And the culture that Washington grows up in the northern neck of Virginia, is one that is dominated by a somewhat to very privileged white male leadership class. If you were emigrating to Virginia in the 17th century specifically, as that colony is founded, it's unlike other colonies. Puritans may be fleeing to the Massachusetts Bay colony. Right? If you're going to Maryland in the early phases, it's because that is supposed to be a safe haven for Catholics, even though that doesn't really last that long as a safe haven for Catholics. Pennsylvania is a bit of an experiment. Going to Virginia in the early phases, the British Crown is really keeping an eye on the people who are going over because they want that colony to be financially successful because of the investments that are being made in the New World to do that. So early families in the 17th century, like the Fairfaxes, the Washingtons, the Custuses, the Lees, are not necessarily your every.
They're not fleeing.
They're not fleeing.
It's an investment.
It's an investment, and they are not your everyday run-of-the-mill John and Jane Q English citizen. So understanding that it is sort of a higher stratosphere of individual going into Virginia is really important. And when Washington's growing up, he's born in 1732. He grows up in the northern neck of Virginia, which is a huge area encompassing millions of acres and 3 degrees of longitude. And that's serious business over there. All of that land belongs to one man, Thomas Fairfax, all of it. And so the Washingtons, the Custuses, the Lees, the Fairfaxes, they're known to each other. The families intermarry. Socially, this is the set where they speak to one another. And that's where Washington is growing up. Now, he is of more modest means, per se.
In the stratosphere.
In the stratosphere, but they're still in the stratosphere. And when his father dies he's aged 11 years old, his mother is left to care for a portion of the estate. But Mary Ball is the second wife of Augustine Washington. So the estate is split. In that kind of instance, you see that the Fairfaxes are taking care of Washington. So they exercise what they call noblesse oblige. To those whom much has been given, much is expected. And we say that so much today that it almost sounds trite, but they're taking care of their own, right? The Fairfaxes exercising that noblesse oblige, that they have a responsibility to one of these fellow.
Okay, now I can understand what you're saying. So, okay, you're one of the crew.
Yes.
So father's died, mother's struggling because she's the second wife. We're still going to take care of you because you're in the group. So we need to make sure the group is successful.
So, and Washington's schools, after any formal schooling, which he does, which is very minimal, really becomes the homes of the Fairfax family. They are trying to bring him up as a gentleman of the Northern Neck and to teach him what it means to be a gentleman, what it means to be somebody of a social class, and also demonstrating to him what is the rubric for success here. And in short, the rubric for success for an English Virginian aristocrat is going to be somebody who has attained the highest degree of freedom possible. And that freedom looks a couple of different ways. One is, of course, a financial freedom, because there is no exterior burden of somebody pushing down on you. You're not worried about debt. You have the freedom to do as you wish because financially you have no constraints. But it's also a personal freedom in many ways. If you were to talk to Washington, I think he would tell you that being possessed of oneself is a pathway to freedom because you're checking your passions. You're understanding what your limitations may be. You're understanding what your weaknesses may be, and that you're working for your entire life to overcome those.
So you are self-sufficient as a self.
As a self. And there's a moral and ethical component to that as well, because you are looking to suppress or eliminate vices to which you may have an inclination. So it really is on multiple fronts how to achieve those things. He also grows up in a society where freedom is not for everybody. And what we would look at in the 21st century, rightly, as a great human inequality, makes total sense to that world. The 18th century aristocrats in Virginia, when they look at natural law, would tell you natural law tells us that nothing on earth is equal.
There is a strata.
There is a strata. That if you were to look at all human beings or all animal life, you would not find two beings that are precisely equal. And that sort of philosophy sets the stage for it to be acceptable in that day and age for there to be a stratosphere of who experiences freedom and how much they experience. That a wealthy landowning Virginian like a Fairfax is going to have the most freedom possible. That tenant farmers and craftsmen will experience freedom to a degree, but certainly not as much. Indentured servants, even less, and slaves, none at all. But they see that as part of the natural hierarchy of how the world works. So culturally, a young Washington grows up in a place where there are segments of society that are going to experience less freedom, and he's okay with that. And he will even warn his plantation manager. In the years before the American Revolution, Washington will host thousands of visitors at Mount Vernon after he takes over that property, following the death of his half-brother Lawrence. And he tells his manager to be careful about the type of people you are familiarizing yourself with and how much attention that you give to them. He believes that everybody should be treated with a degree of civility, and you shouldn't be mean towards other individuals, but how much you let them in. If you let him in,
That's with the strata.
that's what's the strata, because then it brings you down if you're associating with people from a lower stratosphere.
And this is a strata that he's inherited and still emulates because he assumes he's being adopted and understanding it from the strata of his country. And I'm going to use that because up until then, his country, his affiliation is British.
No, his country is very much England.
And what he aspires to in that freedom and that is his interpretation of what it means to be an honorable British gentleman. Because why don't we layer into this? So, because I like how you started with Fairfax, because that gets him to his core. And to talk about the freedom, I think will play out, obviously, because freedom comes up as we talk about what happens with freedom. So then he starts his military journey in doing British service and encounters, well, unexpectedly, what he thought in terms of his ability to go forward, his ability to continue to maintain his freedom and his independent thought, and he hits places where it doesn't work for him.
Yeah, his military career starts very young. He's 20 years old when he's commissioned a major in the Virginia Regiment. When that's a lot for a 20-year-old. And not only is he commissioned as a major, but in 1752, he's sent from Williamsburg by Virginia's governor, along with a guide, Christopher Gist, to travel into what is now northwestern Pennsylvania to a French outpost called Fort Le Boeuf to find out why the French are there and to politely let them know that they're on English land. You've got a 20-year-old diplomatic emissary on this mission. That's pretty grueling if you think about going from Williamsburg all the way up into Northwest. He's doing it in winter as well. It's tough, and he writes about the fact that it's tough. And, it's a journey of several hundred miles for him to get there, be cordially greeted and told basically to buzz off because it's French land. What are you going to do about it? And it's his first taste of working as a diplomat. He's young. He's naive. He comes back to Williamsburg, writes a report. And when he writes this report about his adventures to Fort Le Boeuf, it's the first time that Washington becomes famous, is the best way to look at it, because the reports he writes are printed, not just in Virginia, but circulated in England. So even George II at this point is aware of this young Virginian named George Washington because of the work that he's done and the reports that he's written. As the French and Indian War comes about, you see Washington at Drummondville Glen, and then at Fort Necessity, where he learns some really difficult lessons, where he's defeated at Fort Necessity roundly. And if you go to 1755, Washington is only 23 when Braddock tries to take Fort Duquesne, modern-day Pittsburgh. And Braddock had really taken Washington in. And I look at the relationship between Washington and Braddock very much the way that I look at Washington and the Fairfax family.
Okay.
And I think for Washington, despite these setbacks at Fort Necessity previously and his command suffering a lot of casualties, having disgracefully surrendered to the French there, the Braddock campaign kind of rejuvenates him when he understands there's going to be this push towards Fort Duquesne. And the fact that Braddock is willing to let Washington serve as part of his military family, a young Washington most likely sees that as, here is my next person. Here's my guy who's going to help me out. He's going to help me achieve.
Because that's what he's experienced with Fairfax. So you assume it's next.
He assumes it's next. Unfortunately, Braddock is mortally wounded as part of that campaign, and now his benefactor is gone. And Braddock, the signs point to, had promised Washington a commission in the British Army. And I think that's what Washington wanted more than anything.
Because that would be the accolade, right? That would show him that he's come into his own.
And it's not without precedent. It wouldn't be as if it was a special arrangement. There was something in the British Army in the 1750s called raising for rank. And if you could demonstrate military ability and you had the ability to recruit enough individuals that you could get rank in the British Army, particularly with a provincial royal regiment. And it's what he wants. He wants it desperately. And yet he grows up in a family where there is a lot of honor given to military service. His half brother Lawrence had fought in the British Navy and had fought at Cartagena in the 1740s. Something a young Washington, I think, is always aspiring to. Here's this guy, Braddock, this enigmatic leader who's come over, and here's the person who can put him in the position where he wants to be. But now they've suffered this horrendous defeat. Braddock is gone. And you've still got Washington working as an officer within the Virginia Regiment. But when Britain sends its new commander-in-chief to North America in the form of Lord Loudon, he doesn't care for provincials very much and doesn't think much of Washington.
But all of a sudden, that feeling of being able to credentialize himself, being able to work it, he doesn't check the boxes. So no longer the freedoms and the choices he thought were ahead of him were gone.
Yeah. You have somebody now who the rubric's not working, right? The rubric may not have always been easy for Washington in a lot of ways in the 1740s and 1750s. But when he runs into this stumbling block with Loudon, now the rubric has failed him for the first time. And we really don't have a good record of what happens. Washington and Loudon meet personally in the Pennsylvania State House, probably on the second floor. Washington has traveled from Winchester, Virginia to Philadelphia to basically make a case for why his Virginia provincials should be adopted as a royal regiment. But we know it doesn't end well for him in any way, shape, or form.
Well, because up until then, he could probably think, I'm going to have a conversation with somebody who's going to listen to me because I've been listened to so far. I've been heard. And he probably, if we were going to guess, got dismissed.
Yep.
Because obviously that was a conversation. And to the mental model that you've already set up, then all of a sudden, the participation in his ability to be free or have that oversight of who he is and it's now gone.
And I think we can all relate to that because I think for many of us in life, no matter at what age, we're typically presented with a rubric for success, whether it be in an educational environment, whether it be in a professional environment, that if we do X, Y, and Z, then the result should be this positive one for us if we do it well.
Yeah.
But there are times I think when all of us have run into the rubric not working for us, and it's never a good feeling in any way, shape, or form.
But I will say, for anybody listening out there, that those are usually the moments you get put in the right direction. Because thank goodness as a country it didn't work. Because if it's okay, I'm going to start to pivot on what happens. And obviously we're going to fast forward because there's a lot of life that happens between that moment and he walked into Philadelphia wearing a general's uniform to get this job. But if we take it for a moment, the leadership lesson in the moment is the things that don't work are usually for the right reasons. You've just got to keep moving forward to figure out why. In that moment, Washington says, okay, I'm going to go back. I'm going to go back to the rubric that I do know, which is I'm going to be back and be a planter, et cetera. Fast forward. Now, if it's okay for me to fast forward a bit, marries Martha. We have a plantation, and then things continue. The Americans are starting to not like the rubric that the British are now giving them. And Washington then walks into a Philadelphia room with a lot of decision makers wearing a general's outfit. And for some reason, he was seen as the appropriate continental commander-in-chief. Glossed over a lot, so feel free to fill in some of those details.
I guess the thing to fill in that would be really important is a little bit about the rubric that the colonist feels failing on. So if we think about being a British subject in the 18th century, and particularly the period immediately following what we call the French Indian War, 1763 in my mind is the high point of pride to be a British colonist. Because with the successful completion of that war in North America and in Europe, now North America should be free as a wellspring resource for the British to fuel global empire. It's the crown jewel of the Western Hemisphere. And ostensibly, the French have been pushed out. Ostensibly, the Spanish have been pushed out. The British have picked up Canada. They picked up East and West Florida. There's potential for expansion westward if they want to pursue doing that. So in 1763, I think for most colonists who'd fought arm in arm, many of them with the mother country in the successful military endeavor, this was a glorious and rosy future for the British Empire and the best time in the world to be British. Not just from the perspective of, hey, we've just won this massive military campaign, but political pride to live in what undoubtedly in the 18th century was the freest society in the world. Britain had untied the Aristotelian knot in terms of how do we effectively govern people? Because in the 18th century, as it is today, Britain's a constitutional monarchy. So it's not absolute monarchy like France or Spain. It's not despotism like Russia. There is this very interesting and intricate balance structure within the British system of government, which is a direct result of the fact that Britain had fought a civil war from 1642 to 1651.
So they were enlightened, for lack of a different description.
Enlightened and immersed in the classical theory. The English Civil War, in short, is about a king becoming a tyrant. And what do we do? Right? And then you have Cromwell, the period of the Protectorate, and then finally they get this together with this constitutional monarchy. The knot that Aristotle had presented to the world in ancient times was that if you are going to govern a society or a state, which is essential, you have to understand that there are three main components, no matter what. There's going to be one component known as the one, and that is the supreme ruler. If that is an emperor, if that is a caliph, if that is a king, whatever you want to call it,
There's a one.
there's a one. And that person has a virtue in that they have the ability to motivate a society and to lead a society forward in a positive manner. The potential vice for the one is they can become a tyrant very quickly when they realize how much power they wield. They could use that for good or could use it for bad. Just below the one, Aristotle identifies the few. And he defines the few as the people who are learned, who have achieved wealth, who have traveled, who are wise. These are individuals who understand the ways of the world, of economy, of politics, who can advise the one as he governs. Then there are the demos, or the many. And the many have the virtue of trying to attain as much liberty or freedom as possible while being the economic engine of the state for the most part. The problem with the many is that they have a vice and they could result to mob law and anarchy and pull the state down from the inside. So I should have said about the few, their vice is that they could turn into an oligarchy who are trying to influence government for gain, right? So Aristotle's problem was how do we get this together? That was the knot. And the British untie it with constitutional monarchy by saying, okay, the one is our king. We're our queen, this person who is a hereditary power figure.
Yes.
The few will be the House of Lords. These people are often hereditary as well, but they're the wealthiest people in the land, the most wise people in the land, and they can offer good advice. And then what do we do about the demos, the many? And that's where the House of Commons comes into play. And Commons is the only branch of the British government that has the ability to vote to levy tax. And they represent the people. They are elected by the people. And granted, in the 18th century, what the electorate looks like is a lot different than today. But everything's an evolution. And the House of Commons being duly elected by the people, they represent them. They are the ones that have the ability to levy tax. And if you're in Commons, you have to pay tax. So you're going to pay the same taxes that you're willing to levy upon your constituents. So this system of checks and balances is working very neatly until Britain decides to start taxing after the French and Indian War.
To pay for it.
To pay for it. And the objection of most colonists is not to the fact that they're being taxed or that they're contributing to public defense or public finance. All that seems very wise. If you look beneath the no taxation without representation slogan that we hear about, what many colonists are saying is, well, you violated the British Constitution because I don't have anybody in Commons representing me. I've never elected the individuals who are supposing that we should pay this tax. The tax is unlawful. The tax is unconstitutional. I don't have to pay it.
And you've grounded the entity that's your gem or one of the gems at this point in time.
So, yeah, for most of these colonists, when they're moved to rebellion, now look, tax solicitation is part of it. Of course, there's a lot of other stuff that's happening too that's going to push people towards rebellion, particularly from all different segments of society. And a lot of it's the heavy-handed treatment of the crown when you get into the 1760s and 1770s. Of course, when they do things like the shutting in the port of Boston, you're starving out women and children of all political persuasions. When you do things like the Quebec Act of 1774, and, the French were your enemy. 11 years before, but now you're letting French Canadians move into the Ohio River Valley.
Like, who are we to you? Like, that's the theme that you hear is like,
Right.
Well, don't you care about us too?"
Yeah.
Because it just seems like you're caring about everyone else but us, so we're gonna care about ourselves.
We become sort of the redheaded stepchild who it is constitutionally violated on occasion after occasion. And I think it's a nuanced point, but it's a fine one, particularly as we look at the experience of rebellion in North America. And I'd like to be careful to say it is a rebellion until we declare independence. For many of these individuals who consider themselves patriots, and patriot is not a dirty word in the 18th century when they're thinking about this, they don't want to break away from Britain. They want a redress of a constitutional grievance, of a wrong.
'Cause that's what happened before. There was, oh, there was s obviously, there was fight, we got redress, we just need another moment. We're not looking to completely say bye-bye, we're just trying to say, "You need to pay attention to."
Absolutely. And they would see, I think many of them in the early phases, that what they're fighting for, they consider this an extension of the English Civil War. I mean, James Otis is one of the most virulent revolutionaries coming out of Massachusetts. But in 1764, James Otis is saying that the British system of government is the most perfect the world has ever seen. I
That
think
they're
that
just
tells you
they're just trying to figure out how to make this better system work better,
right.
not completely upend it.
Yes, absolutely.
So then, I'm gonna fast forward only because you built that. And I'm wondering, when do we parallel where Washington gets into the revolution? And because I think we need to fast forward to the arc, because I want to spend a lot of time in Valley Forge, which is quite an arc to go through, but you've done a good job of building up. Here's the mental model, like you said, rubric of how they thought through the world. We're not trying to upend it. We're trying to make it better because we already think it's great. We just need to make it better. So we participate in it. But the participation continues to not happen, not happen. And so there's growth that Washington has to get to the moment where he realizes he needs to be the leader of Valley Forge. The rubric with Valley Forge is Washington, he's not looking at his world as one, the few, the many, and that he needs to think about them differently. He's thinking of, how do I see value in each of the layers? And because the layers are much more diverse, right? The model he had before in the structure, there were very defined characteristics that defined those layers. Now we're defining it based on how you're showing up for a moment.
Yep.
And he's realizing the value is in the many, not the top. The top need to serve the many. Let's start with what the many looks like, because before you really talked, I have to admit, I had a point of view of the many at Valley Forge that was too clean. Can you give the perspective of, when we talk about Valley Forge, how different everybody is? How many languages, just in flavor of the languages, the religions, how many people are signing up to the idea of America? But that's the only commonality when we talk about the people who are there.
Yeah, it's a really diverse place, when you get to Valley Forge, and diverse even by modern standards, I would think. And you're right, when we look at paintings, when we see a lot of documentaries, not just Valley Forge, but typically the American Revolution in general, it looks extremely white and it looks extremely male. Okay, let's start with age, right? We have children there as young as maybe 8 to 10 years old. Most of those children are camp followers, but you have 12-year-olds who are serving as musicians. We have records of men approaching the age of 80 in the ranks. Now, granted, there's not a whole lot of them, but it's important to recognize there are some men in their 70s approaching 80 who are serving the ranks of Valley Forge.
Not, I mean, people in their 90s or older at this, if we were going to just skew considerers.
You have life expectancies.
Yeah.
But if you're to look at that army overall, the majority are going to be Anglo, but Anglo doesn't always mean that.
Common or similar.
Right, they're common or similar. Certain portions of the Valley Forge encampment, you could walk through maybe 1,000 men and never hear English spoken because in Whedon and Muhlenberg's brigade, most of them are Germans. They're coming from the Germanic states because, of course, Germany's not unified until von Bismarck, so it's a bunch of principalities and states. But either those men serving in the army are the first generation to come here to North America, where their parents had come before them. They are very recent immigrants to this country. You would have heard English, German, French, Spanish, Dutch, Portuguese. Name any other European language, you would have heard.
Well,
And then you have, of course, Anglicans. but Presbyterians, but then you have Lutherans, you have Catholics. There are Jews at Valley Forge as well. We have records of Hanukkah being observed there in December of 1777, which most people don't think about, and there's a wild amount of religious diversity that's there in the Army. When you think about diversity in terms of where people are coming from, so you probably would have heard some African languages spoken there as well.
There would have been some native,
Native influence. There are 150 Oneidas there for a portion of the encampment, serving as guides and scouts for Washington. They arrive a little bit later in the spring. They're there. They're part of the story. And somewhere between 800 and 1,000 people of color who are serving at Valley Forge as well, too. And they come from markedly different backgrounds.
This is a very diverse immigrant. And I'm going to say that because to be American at some level, your story starts with being an immigrant. And let me layer in. So now we're in a place, if you're not signing up to follow a constitutional monarchy, which is under the British, now you're just signing up for an idea.
Okay.
But even then, you have to win hearts and minds around this idea. But even the idea of what America needs to be has got to be different.
It does. And let's go back to 1775 for a minute, because I think when you talk about people showing up for the moment,
Mm.
right? The person who's showing up for the moment at Cambridge in 1775, in terms of Washington, who's just been named commander-in-chief of this new Continental Army, when he gets to Cambridge and sees what's around him over there, he's horrified. He refers to New Englanders as exceedingly dirty and nasty people. He sees some of the Massachusetts regiments around him, particularly Glover's regiment, who are guys from Marblehead, Beverly, Lynn, Salem, seafaring communities where they're fishermen or merchants, where there's a high degree of racial integration in those regiments. And you've got a guy from the Northern Neck.
He's like, I don't get
Oh, well, that doesn't compute for me.
because he still had a little bit of that Aristotelian framework in his head.
He's got that. And for him to see Indians or people of color serving side by side with white soldiers, he doesn't want it. And I think that's important to acknowledge. He sees that as something that he feels should not be. He does not want blacks enlisted in the Army to begin with. He very quickly changes his mind. When you get to late 1775, it's now something that he has sort of changed his tune on. I think part of it is necessity, right? Because he knows he needs people in the Army. But I think the other part of it is he's understanding that in order to be successful, you have to take a look at why is this culture different? Why are these people from New England different? Why are they doing these sorts of things? And in order for us to be successful here, we're all going to have to work together. So I think arriving at that moment, Washington's looking at culture shock and then trying to figure out, how do I work with these people? And it's not just Washington. Early when he gets there, these are all New Englanders in Cambridge. But as time goes on in 75, you have regiments coming from the Pennsylvania backcountry. You have regiments that are coming from Virginia. And when the Virginians get to Massachusetts and see black soldiers serving side by side with whites, there is a race riot within the camp of the Continental Army that involves more people than about as Lexington and Concord. And Washington and his enslaved valet, Billy Lee, are the people who break that race riot up. I think that's overlooked. To think about that for a minute. This guy is coming from Philadelphia. He's coming with this cultural background. He's been assigned this job. He's got to know it's a difficult one, that he's going to have to.
But he still has a little bit of the British mental model, or at least the Virginia mental model in his head, and he sees something vastly different. And for everybody who's on it, you can probably say we all have our mental model. We have the biases that we show up with, and he acknowledged pretty early in his growth in that role that his biases were not going to serve him well.
Correct. And I think that's what 75 shows him in many ways. That experience at Cambridge is that he's going to have to shed some of that. And it also shows him that he has to shed some of the things that he thought were the right way to go in terms of how does a military commander act. If you look at Washington in the 1750s, he's a really harsh commander when it comes to discipline.
Extremely harsh.
Extremely harsh.
There's no forgiving. There's no mentorship. There's no let me lift you up.
No, it is flogging, or for desertions. When Washington is experiencing a high degree of desertion in the Virginia regiment, he builds a scaffold that is 40 feet tall so that everybody can see the men who are being hanged for desertion.
Because he has that, I'm going to keep going back of how you did the Aristotelian. He's got that mental model, that success. We all need to follow the success. That's going to help us. And he's realizing if I can go back to Valley Forge in 1777 or 78, depending where you want to land, that model's not going to work.
No, and he realizes it as early as 75 because that race riot that I referenced,
Yeah.
what do we do in the aftermath of that, right? How's the discipline being meted out? He runs in there with Billy Lee and dissolves this riot, but there aren't hangings, there aren't floggings. He realizes that there may need to be a different approach to how we do discipline, and it's something that he sees and adapts to early on. And I think, Elaine, it serves him really well by the time he gets to Valley Forge in 1777 and 1778, because he understands that this army is going to be one that is truly diverse in many ways when it comes to the way people look, when it comes to languages, when it comes to faith background, but also when it comes to how do those people think about freedom,
Yes.
right? How do those people think about liberty? Because Washington's model of freedom we established really well. That's what it looks like for this aristocrat. But his idea of freedom is really different from the New Englanders. For the New Englanders, they tend to focus more on what is the will of the many than they do on anything else. They don't really look at Aristotle's model the same way there. When Washington talks about New Englanders being a leveling, he calls them a leveling set that are influenced by the principles of democracy. What Washington is saying when he says they're influenced by the principles of democracy, he's not referring to a system of government because that system of government doesn't exist yet. What he's referring to is the principles of the demos, that
Mhm.
culturally speaking
Of the many.
of the many. And for a New Englander, what is the highest ethos of the state is that the will of the demos, the will of the many, should be
And that's upended to where he grew up to meet that moment.
right.
Well, because in the moment that he is, let's just call it the leader of Valley Forge. I know he is military leader, but he's also the civic leader of Valley Forge. Help me with my facts, but my memory is that's the third largest city in the American colonies at that point in time because of the number of people who are there.
It becomes the third largest city in the colony. So only Philadelphia and New York are bigger. Now, of course, the size of Valley Forge fluctuates a little bit over time. It is a 6-month encampment. But if you look at when they get there are about 15,000 human beings. If you're looking at military personnel plus the women and children who are following the army, there's 15,000 human beings as part of this. They go in there and create a city out of nothing. There's no infrastructure. These are open farm fields. By the time the army leaves in June of 1778, it's somewhere between 18 and 20,000.
I'm getting excited and things are moving. So, because that's the story I wanted to better tell with Valley Forge, because it hit me to say that this is not a leader. This is not a military leader that's just drilling military. He is actually a civic leader. He is making sure he's taking care of the freedom and the accountability of the people that he's overseeing. He's trying to make sure he's meeting their moment and meeting their value. He's trying to honor who they are to be here. And he's trying to honor their choice of freedom, to make sure that what he believes in and the version of freedom that he wants to support and fight for can live on through these people, diverse, complex, that are here. And that takes a lot of growth from where he started.
A ton. And I think if you talk about being there and meeting the moment, the fact that Washington is even there speaks volumes to these men. I've given hundreds of tours over the years at Valley Forge. And one of the questions I get every so often, which is really fair, and I love this question, is, were the soldiers upset that George Washington stayed in a house for the winter? And the answer is no, they weren't upset. It's expected that he's going to do that. And there's a military necessity if you're going to run an army that he really can't be in a log hut or in a tent during the winter months. But underneath that all, the fact that Washington exercises the choice to remain with the army during the winter.
Because that seems normal now. But in the British side,
Not
that's not.
necessarily. He could have gone home to Mount Vernon if he wanted to. And, you think about
And Martha came to him.
Martha
She didn't stay there.
and that's important. If we look at that quiet leadership and that quiet support is we started when we talked about my career or anybody's career. You never do it all alone. There's always a support network there,
Yes.
whether it's the people on a team that you help to manage who are making everything move forward. That's one part of the support network. But the other support network is,
Your family.
yeah, that what is not seen to the rest of the world for the most part, which I guarantee you, nobody survives without that support. And she's there for him. She's present in that moment. It's an 8-year war. There are 8 winter encampments. Washington goes home in 8 years twice. He is home at Mount Vernon for less than 10 days during the entire course of the American Revolution.
And it's not what I would also say quiet leadership where she is just kowtowing to that dynamic because it's obviously dynamic. She's showing up for the camp. She's showing up for the moment.
She's there. She's there in that moment, and I think, the fact that she travels all 8 years, just to, like, let that sink in. Every winter she goes to travel to see him. Valley Forge is not close to Mount Vernon. That is the closest trip that woman makes in 8 years. Everything else is even farther away than that. So that's arduous. But yes, to your point, she is present. She doesn't just go support George, be a comforting presence. When she is there, she is working towards the benefit and welfare of the army, and typically with the wives of other general officers. So she is leading the social circle. She's leading the relief circle at the same time when she's there. So she is working extremely hard to help him.
And they had a lot to lose. I'm not saying that a lot of people didn't have a lot to lose in the moment, but there is a difference of the degree to fall.
Oh, sure. Without a doubt, Washington's one of the wealthiest men in the colonies, or the new United States of America at that point in time. And he could very easily lose it all. If the British were to come up the Potomac, shell Mount Vernon, or if there is a raid in Virginia. There are a couple of times during the war where Washington writes home with instructions to say, if this happens, this is what you need to do to protect certain pieces of paperwork. He is making dispositions in some of the darkest days of the war, assuming that he is going to lose everything. And I think the fact that he assumes he's going to lose everything
Says a lot.
says a lot, because he doesn't give up, right? He never gives up. And if you go back even to the end of the New York campaign in 1776, when the British take that city and they offer peace terms to the Americans, which would have resulted in clemency for all military and political leaders, and the answer is no, we're going to keep fighting. I mean, that's wild.
Well, because then you tell a different story because I think there's a point when you look in the paintings, you think, okay, Washington, but he's getting the gravitas, he's getting the accolades of having that role. But in that moment, what you see is he is showing up with as much to lose, you know, as anybody who's there, and he's trying to honor that everybody there has something to lose and something to gain. And how does he make it successful? And he's not going to be successful from just being up here. But yes, he needs a different vantage point. Yes, he needs a different point of view to look at it because of the leadership moment he needs to sign up for. But he needs to see the people.
Yep. And the fact that he is present, and not just present at Valley Forge in a house as an administrator, right? He doesn't do
He walks it.
He walks it. It's like a good supervisor doesn't just stay locked in their office and deal with meetings and emails and all that sort of thing. He's present at the moment. He's there among the army, but then he is among the army physically, regularly, constantly. He's hearing the complaints. He's seeing the lack of supplies. He's seeing the lack of clothing. He's seeing the lack of food, because he has to know what is the condition of this army so that he can work whatever machinations he possibly can to help them and care for them.
And there's a topic that's too tempting, so I'm going to try to avoid it, is how he navigates not only to be there, but then he has to navigate Congress.
Sure.
And that's a whole nother leadership lesson that it's ripe for analyzing. But the one I want to instead layer into the conversation is because he has that fingertip touch and because he's walking, he's also identifying talent. And he's making sure that he is cultivating that talent and helping them. And I'm going to go back to the way you described how he approached himself is how do they discipline themselves so that they can show up as leaders? So he's not going and just saying, you're landed gentry, you're landed gentry, you're landed, therefore you're going to be
Mhm.
that second layer you talked about in the knot. He's actually looking for character, which again, and you talk about growth, is he's not doing the characteristics that he grew up with. His eye and his leadership soul is now looking for how do I look for people of character so I can mentor them in that moment to lift them up like Fairfax did for me, and how do I take care of it, but in a different definition.
I think it's a great leadership quality in that you are looking for the character, you're looking for the ability, and he's looking to put people in places where he can set them up to succeed.
And they don't have the characteristics on paper for success that he grew up with.
Well, no, and if you think about, and I think it's another evolution of Washington. So let's look at Washington early in the war. He's putting together his staff, his aides de camp, his military family. Most of those people initially are going to come from the families he knows in Virginia, or families from Maryland that he's familiar with. People like Robert Hanson Harrison or Tench Tillman. It's no accident that they're with Washington immediately. He's taking the Fairfax model. But then if you look as Washington continues to serve, some of his most trusted and able lieutenants become people like Nathaniel Greene, a Quaker from Rhode Island, wow, is that a different world culturally than what you could ever expect? Anthony Wayne from Pennsylvania. So he is, I think, actively looking at who are these people who display ability, even if it's rough ability, right? But then the moral character. Moral character is something in Washington when he's looking at himself, when he looks at the world around him, his understanding of what sound moral character and decision making should be. That's something he always focuses on. It's really important to him. It's why he doesn't get along with a Horatio Gates. It's why he doesn't get along with a Charles Lee.
Because they're still using the mental model of, do you check the box? We're just fine tuning the British rubric. And he's saying that's not the model anymore. If we're going to embrace really what we're fighting for, which is the idea that we need to create freedoms beyond the model that we've been given from the British, I can't just tweak it. I got to look past the characteristics into somebody's character.
And he will look deeper into the character in an ethical and moral way, even beyond that. With somebody like a Charles Lee, who was known to hoard him, for example. Washington's also constantly not lecturing, but advising the young officers of the army, like, these are some vices you have to watch out for. Gambling. He talks about this at Valley Forge. Admonitions against gaming, admonitions against finding prostitutes. He wants to preserve physical and moral health of the army and of the officer corps too. So there is that moral character base that he's looking for and that he expects in officers. He does expand his vision of what's possible. I mean, even with the view of how Washington will interact with foreign officers and the level of trust he's going to put to foreign officers,
Yeah.
like a von Steuben when we talk about him, but that there's a lot of trust that Washington is placing into somebody at that point who religiously, culturally, and linguistically,
Language.
right?
And how they present, because Washington's never known to be fiery. Von Steuben, a little bit.
Yeah, Washington is reserved. Like, he commands a room when he walks into it. There's no questioning that, but it's a reserved command presence. Whereas von Steuben's presence is a lot more gregarious when he comes into a room. Like, you cannot miss him. So
I feel like I missed out on a moment listening to von Steuben cuss.
I would have loved to have heard that in every language.
In every language? Or we're getting ahead of ourselves. So it's the thing I want to take away, and I want to make sure we haven't left a corner untouched in this, is that Washington did not repurpose who he was in order to be successful in the American model. He redid it from the ground up. That the model he saw into the British, which is what we default to as humans. Let me look at characteristics. Let me look at my knowns. Let me judge somebody because they're like me. That he realized that he could not do that to be successful in a model that he was going to embrace as whatever the American experiment was going to be. I can't look for what my biases tell me is someone like me that is successful. I have to take ownership as a leader to see beyond that and to see someone's character and potential.
Absolutely.
And Valley Forge, I think, is the moment, wait for the pun, that forged. Oh, thank you. Yeah, I've been waiting for that the whole.
Yep, there you go. Yep, yep. It does, and he has to learn how to be comfortable with being uncomfortable, right? And what I mean by that is he has to put himself in situations where he's working with these people who have the different ideas of liberty and freedom, and even beyond the Aristotelian knot. We talked about the levelers from Massachusetts, but then who are these people also in the army who culturally are actually really different from Washington and really different from these New Englanders? And I mean, like the Scots-Irish. So the Presbyterians who are living on the frontier, or the Germans who are in the army who have come from rank poverty within the Germanic states, areas that are still suffering from the Hundred Years' War, that they're coming to the New World in North America, and they're trying to escape serfdom, right? And they're trying to escape tyrannical oppression. And for those people, it's not a stratosphere, or it's not the fact that the demos should be, dictating the will of the state to a certain extent. For the Presbyterians and for the Germans, there is financial motivation, but there's also a real individualistic sense of liberty. Like, liberty is about me as a person for them, not so much as it is about the state or how we fall into some abstract constitutional debate. These people just want to be able to live their lives to the best of their ability. And they're fighting for that here. And because when they see how the British react in the 1760s and 1770s, they go, wait a minute, that looks like a lot like the tyranny that we just left. So we're going to fight against those guys. But we
I
want.
want more independent decision making of what it looks like for Mary. And this is why as we kind of round out the conversation, I wanted to tell the story because, again, through a lot of the insights that you started to share with me, and obviously then you sparked my interest to read just a little bit. I think that's a better representation of how Washington started our American legacy. Because the other thing I've learned through you is Valley Forge is really that, and I'm going to use the pun again because it's worth it, forging moment
Yeah.
of when it changes. We think of Valley Forge as just a cold moment, but it's different to the extent that I ever had everybody represent to me. That's a moment we become more American than colonies.
Oh, absolutely.
And that American definition, I mean, you've hit it from so many different ways. Communication styles, reservation versus gregarious, language, religion, where you grew up, how you're even embracing and why are you embracing the American idea and why are you showing up? And Washington's not going to show up in that moment to confirm his biases because then you lose. He's showing up to figure out where the value is in these people who are connected loosely through signing up for this to hopefully get on the other side.
I have always said the Valley Forge winter is a time when you begin to see a sense of national identity first within the army, then before you'll ever see it in the civilian population. I think what we consider our original 13 colonies, there's a sense that perhaps we are growing into some sort of nationhood as a result of this military conflict, and they're only halfway through it by the time you get to Valley Forge. Or loose connection and confederation of these little 13 nation states. But I think the Army is seeing the value of nationalism in the best sense of the word before the civilian population sees those sorts of things. Particularly when you look at things like race relations within the Army. There were race riots in 1775. Is the Continental Army a place of racial harmony? No, not by any means. I would never make that claim. But you don't see these sorts of things. Nobody has a problem with the fact that there are black troops serving Rhode Island regiments. And there are catalysts for change there that come from unexpected quarters. So Rhode Island is interesting in that they are, in order to meet their quotas for enlistments, taking household slaves, putting them into the Army, and promising manumission with ultimate victory and compensation to masters for loss of slave property. 21st century eyes, totally wildly inappropriate, and I get that. But what I ask people to think of is, let's put that on hold for a second, and let's look at the ripple effect of Rhode Island's actions.
Because now it's mixed up who you're fighting next to.
Correct. And it's also inspired other young children of the Enlightenment like John Lawrence, who is a staff officer working for George Washington. He is a South Carolinian. He comes from the wealthiest family in South Carolina, whose entire fortune is wrapped up in slavery, whether it's the slave trade or whether it is plantation-based economy. And John Lawrence is writing to his father, Henry, who happens to be the president of Congress, during the Valley Forge encampment to say, and I'm going to put this on the drumhead and paraphrase it, "Hey, Dad, look at what Rhode Island is doing to help the Army. Why aren't we in South Carolina?" And for me, if you breathe and let it sink in.
He's saying there's value in the people who are showing up. Why aren't you providing the same value? And he's seeing value in those people.
Yep. And again,
instead of seeing them as less.
it's imperfect, but the point is it's catalytic. And if we look at the revolutionary experience as one of constant evolution, then we have to find those catalytic moments that move
That evolved.
Yep.
Don't judge it by the evolution we're at now, and judge it by the moment in it. The moment.
They evolve socially, they evolve politically as an army, they evolve as a professional fighting force as an army, to be sure, during that winter. And it's important that they do, because that army at Valley Forge is unlike the army in the first 2 years of the war. The first 2 years of the war, Congress would only authorize continental enlistments for 1 year, because Congress is afraid of a standing army for a long period of time. And that's a British thing. Because if you look at the British Army in the 18th century, people just assume, oh, it's the Royal Army. Actually, it's not. The British Army in the 18th century is entirely the creature of Parliament. The British Army cannot exist in the 18th century unless Parliament reauthorizes its validity every year under the Mutiny.
So it's the finger of Parliament.
It's the finger of Parliament. And that is to help with the checks and balances system in Britain. Oh, the king can't just say, I'm going to use the army to suppress everybody over here because it's mine. Well, it doesn't belong to him. It belongs to Parliament.
So they don't see the army as a fighting, they see it as a suppressor, which means it's conflicted.
Yeah, because it's the constabulary force in Britain, too. There is no police force in the 18th century. And there's really no police force as we know it anywhere. So early, my point is that the Continental Army is reenlisting every year. Congress is saying, okay, that old army goes away. Now we reestablish a new army, 1775, 1776, which makes Washington insane because it's like it's not enough time for him to be able to mold them into something effective. So the army that he has at Valley Forge is the first set of troops that are being authorized enlistments for 3 years or the duration of the conflict. This is the first time that he can actually invest and use a winter to work with them to mold them into something and use them again in the next campaign.
I want to thank you because I think we've captured what I wanted to talk about is the evolution. Because I think we think about the Marvel Man of Washington and that he grew up and he knew how to meet the moment. But I think it's a lot more interesting to say, as our defining American leader, he was all about evolution. He was all about looking past his biases and not making them be his weaknesses. And he was trying to overcome and make sure he always saw and evolved to see somebody on the other side. Because as leaders, it's you have your biases. Don't deny them. They're there. The goal that I appreciate and I get from the better understanding that I have, the evolution I have of Washington, is he continued to challenge himself to see the value in somebody, not just the characteristics.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I hope from this you get a lot more tours from Valley Forge, not that you don't always already. And I just want to say thank you for everybody. I hope this story has helped you, and I hope to talk to you soon.